I'm Katrina Zifford. I'm a philosopher and a lawyer. I'm located out of Elmhurst College, which is outside of Chicago. And I'm going to ask our panelists to just kind of go down the line and explain who you are and what your discipline is.
Okay. I'm David Namias. I'm a lawyer and a justice on the Supreme Court of Georgia and a former federal prosecutor for a long time.
My name is Farah Foucaert. I'm an ethicist from Ghent University, Belgium, and I'm part of the Bioethics Institute there.
Hi. My name is Ekaterina Pivovarova, and I'm a clinical forensic psychologist. I'm also a research fellow out of the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Mass General and a neuroscience fellow at Harvard.
Hi, I'm Brad Cook. I'm a neuroscientist here at Georgia State.
Hello, I'm Paul Davis. I am a philosopher at the College of William and Mary.
And hello, I'm Chris Ryan. I'm a psychiatrist from the University of Sydney.
All right, so here's how we're going to handle things today. We're going to have Chris give us a quick synopsis of the case that we're going to be handling, and then we'll have reactions to the case facts running down our panel. I'm not going to give a reaction. I'm just here to kind of time keep and then to take questions. So we'll listen to Chris first, and then we'll have reactions. And hopefully we'll kind of try and keep our reactions close to 5 minutes, 10 minutes. All right.
Okay, so this working? People can hear me? Yes, excellent. There is a handout about this, which of course hasn't been, in the modern sense, hasn't been handed out. It's in space and you have to pick it up on your iPad. It's in the program. Oh, okay. In that case, you don't have to do that. It's sort of carbon-based technology. Okay, well, that's very good because I'm going to describe the case, but it'd be quite good for you to follow along on that. I'm not going to say much more than is on that already because I figure we want to hear from people about what's going on. So this is a case that began in the years 1989 and 1990. And during that time, Terry Williamson sexually assaulted 5 women, 5 girls, and a boy. It's fair to say that these were truly appalling crimes. Williamson often abducted his victims from the street with knife point and entered their homes. And not only were the lives of his victims permanently scarred from these crimes, but also the people in a hamlet south of Sydney were in fear from the bull-eye rapist, as he came to be known, for a couple of years. He was eventually caught in 1990, and at that time he was 20, and he was sentenced to 24 years imprisonment with a non-parole period of 14 years. In fact, he spent 22 years in prison, and this was essentially because nobody, including him, was very keen on the idea of his getting parole. However, it was coming up towards the end of his 24-year sentence. He would then be released, and it seems for that reason authorities thought that perhaps he should be paroled, and he apparently agreed. And so 2 years ago, he was in fact paroled and had been on parole until the case that's before you. That supervised parole would normally have ended about now because that's when his sentence would have ended. But in 2006, the Australian state of New South Wales, which is where all this takes place, introduced a law that allowed a court to extend a serious sex offender's period of community supervision beyond the period where their sentence would have ended. In the case that we're looking at, that we're using as a springboard for discussion, and it was only heard a few months ago, the state of New South Wales applied for Williamson's supervision in the community to be extended for another 5 years. Among the conditions for this was a stipulation that Williamson continue a treatment begun in prison, which included psychological therapy and the regular administration of cyproterone acetate, which is called Androcur. It also stipulated that he continued to take an antidepressant, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Now, Cyproterone suppresses testosterone activity in the body, and like medroxyprogesterone, also known as Depo-Provera, which is the drug that tends to be used in the US, it's often administered to sex offenders with the hope that it will make recidivism less likely. Williamson was reportedly happy to remain under the supervision order and to take the medication, though he did request it be a 3-year supervision order, not a 5-year supervision order. But anyway, regardless of Williamson's agreement, it was up to the court to determine whether the order should be made. The court heard from a number of psychiatric experts who had assessed and treated Williamson. One of these expressed the view that Williamson met the diagnostic criteria for multiple paraphilias, including sexual sadism. Though there are no other specific diagnoses mentioned, the court was also told that Williamson was prone to feeling lonely and isolated, problems with social adjustment, social anxiety, and experiencing acute mood symptoms and coping with this by blaming others. Williamson had apparently taken part in intensive treatment programs in 1999 and 2001 and in maintenance programs since, and he had reportedly made good progress in all of these. He had commenced cyproterone in 2004, and the judge concluded, again based on evidence from the forensic psychiatrists, that, and I'm quoting here, "It's clear on the evidence that cyproterone is an important aspect of the management of the defendant's risk of further offending, and that," quote, "the evidence reveals that there is a significant and increased risk of the defendant reoffending if the anti-libidinal medication is ceased." The judge also referred to evidence which indicates his sexual thoughts are less prominent and intrusive. However, we're not privy to exactly what that evidence was. Though we do know from another forensic psychiatrist report that Williamson himself reported the beneficial effect of the medication in assisting him in controlling his, quote, deviant fantasies and urges. With respect to the antidepressant, the judge identified those various symptoms that I mentioned above as risk factors for reoffending and suggested, on the evidence of a forensic psychiatrist, that the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor prevented the emergence of these symptoms, and thereby the SSRI would prevent the emergence of risk factors that may contribute to relapse or reoffending. As it happened, Williamson consented to both drugs, though it is probably worth noting that in New South Wales he could not have been compelled to take either drug against his will. However, any non-adherence now with either drug will be in breach of his supervision order, and that could result in a custodial sentence. The extended supervision order was granted. Thanks very much.
All right, so those are the facts of our case, and we're now going to get a response. We can clap for Chris if we'd like. All right, and for a legal perspective now, Justice Namias.
Well, thanks. Actually, it struck me the first question I'd have is he's been out for 2 months. Has he reoffended? Yeah.
As far as nothing in the newspapers.
Well, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I don't get to come to a lot of conferences like this, and this is one that I have real interest in, both directly and through my brother Eddie, who is very active in these topics. And I really wanted to bring kind of 2 practical points to bear on this. The first is it's very interesting to consider cases like Williamson's that involve horrific crimes and fairly unusual neurointerventions like chemical castration or brain surgery, that sort of thing. I think we all have kind of a science fiction fan in us, and it reminds us of things like The Clockwork Orange or 1984. But hopefully everyone is paying as much attention to less exciting but very important neurointerventions that are going on every day at an increasing rate for low-level offenders as part of, at least in this country, the wave of criminal justice reforms that are happening. Hopefully you know some about this, but largely led by conservative states and kind of a Nixon goes to China idea, there have been a lot of changes to try to keep people out of prison and get people who are in prison out that have led to legislation, including in states like Texas and South Carolina and Kentucky, and over the past 3 years here in Georgia. The Obama administration, members of Congress are looking into this at the national level as well. But all of the reforms focus on alternatives to incarceration, both on the front end and the back end of the criminal justice system. The front end, and I think you're going to hear some more about this, are what are called therapeutic courts or restorative courts, drug courts, mental illness courts, veterans courts, juvenile courts. The back end involves some rehabilitation of inmates while they're in custody, but then reentry programs for people who are coming out of prison, some of whom are not low-level offenders, but are people who committed very serious, often violent crimes, but are going to be released into society either on parole or because they've served sometimes very long sentences. My court and I have strongly supported these efforts in Georgia, and we've had pretty significant reform legislation over the last 3 years, and the empirical data so far indicates that they're pretty successful. All of these efforts involve neurointerventions, although until I saw the title for this conference, I hadn't heard that word in the context of these reforms. Brain-altering drugs and non-invasive therapies like counseling and rehabilitation are routine and important roles on both ends of this system. Offenders are required to take medications to treat bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other mental illnesses, to enroll in methadone treatment for opioid addiction. Even more common are what might be called negative neurointerventions. Frequent drug testing, counseling, inpatient care, all designed to keep people from altering their brains with illicit drugs and alcohol. In fact, one of the most fundamental basic ideas behind mental illness and drug courts is that you're using the threat of incarceration to convince low-level offenders to take the brain-altering medications they need to avoid antisocial conduct and to avoid taking the brain-altering substances that they don't need because it makes them commit crimes. And that's done on the reentry side of these programs as well, again, with the threat of reincarceration. The drugs and the therapies used are things that we use all the time for people who aren't in custody to help them get their lives in order and also to avoid crime and other antisocial behavior. The alternative of going to jail provides a very useful incentive that's sometimes needed to undertake those positive and negative neurointerventions. And I want to focus on that point because while we like talking about these kind of unusual cases like, can we do something to the brain of a serial murderer to prevent them from being aggressive? But there is a very real-world opportunity for people interested in these areas to have an effect with people of all sorts, judges, lawyers, legislators, administrators, who are very interested in making these programs work. Less than a mile from here, Fulton County operates a drug court, a mental illness court, a veterans court, and juvenile courts, all of which use these neurointerventions. And they are very important. And so my first big point is throughout this conference, hopefully you'll think about how these topics not just affect kind of the far out issues or the major offenders, but also huge numbers of everyday offenders where neurointervention can really help keep them out of trouble, prevent further victims, and save a lot of money for society. The second big point I want to make is in these major cases like Williamson's, they're a small subset, and they're the subset that involve people we're worried are going to commit really horrific acts if they're released. And I had some personal involvement in making decisions like this. After 9/11, I spent 3 years at the Department of Justice in Washington, and one of my roles was to serve as the Justice Department's senior representative on a group that reviewed all the people who were being held at Guantanamo Bay to decide whether we thought it was safe to release or transfer them out of military custody, and if so, under what conditions. And there were other senior officials from the intelligence community and the Defense Department. And the decisions were ultimately made at the cabinet level by the Secretary of Defense personally. He had to sign a form saying this person can be released. As you may not really realize, more than 530 people were released from Guantanamo Bay under President Bush, and that process has continued under President Obama with about 80 more people being released. the risks in these cases were high. To give you a sense, we released about 600 people so far. Intelligence agencies assess that about 1/3 of those people returned to the fight. We know that in part because over 25 of those people were killed fighting against the United States, often our military, sometimes our allies. One former detainee led a suicide attack in Pakistan that killed 31 people. Imagine the reaction had that suicide attack occurred in New York City. The issue in those kinds of cases, very similar to the issue in Williamson, is very different than when you're dealing with low-level offenders, because when you're dealing with low-level offenders, authorities will be willing to take a fair amount of risk that they're going to get things wrong. If you have a low-level offender who commits petty crimes and your neurointervention doesn't work, there's going to be another petty crime. If you make a mistake with someone who may commit a horrific crime, a terrorist act, abduct a child, kill or rape someone, and you had to, as an official, personally sign off on the affirmative decision to release that person back into society, you are going to, for bureaucratic reasons, do things very differently. The moral incentives, the political incentives, the diplomatic incentives change the way you analyze that. Even though the chance of a horrible act occurring may be very small, everyone's going to want to know if it happens whose fault it was. There's going to be blue ribbon commissions and there are going to be investigations. And if you are an elected official, there are devastating campaign commercials that can be made. If you remember Mike Dukakis and Willie Horton, for example. So the point on that side is that the actual evidence of risk and the actual scientific and philosophical arguments about neurointerventions, I think, are actually going to be less important. I think what is going to drive those decisions is largely more bureaucratic considerations. And there are two things that come from that. One is worried officials may try almost anything in these situations to try to lower the risk, whether or not there's good empirical proof that it'll work. They'll do that because, if nothing else, it's useful to have someone, particularly a forensic expert, to blame if things go bad. As I listen to the Williamson discussion, I think of that judge who's making a very difficult decision and wants the ability, if things go wrong, to say, it wasn't me, I'm just a judge. I had an expert tell me it would work. And then from an ethics standpoint, I think you want to look at those cases because I think officials are willing to take risks that they wouldn't take in the case of low-level offenders because they're willing to try anything to try to reduce the risks. And so the incentives to engage in neurointerventions that may be more ethically questionable are higher. The last thing I'll say is I like following these issues. What neurointerventions are actually going to be allowed and used on criminal defenders under what circumstances? It's initially a decision for legislators and regulators, hopefully informed by scientists and philosophers like you. But in the end, at least in this country, those decisions will probably ultimately be pushed up and judges will have to decide if they're legal and constitutional. And so hopefully when we get to those difficult questions, we'll have some good input from people who've thought about them very carefully. So thanks again for letting me participate, and I look forward to hearing the other comments and questions.
Thank you for that. I want to actually, from an ethics perspective, focus on three different questions which I think are important, and one follows up on what you've mentioned. Is first, a more general question: is a sentence of 24 years in prison the correct answer for this type of offender? Because he is a very serious offender. There were up to 19 offenses, most of them violent offenses, with 11 different victims, some of which were children. So, and he is diagnosed with multiple mental disorders, sexual disorders, such as sexual sadism and pedophilia. And the average victims number for pedophilia is 20. So we can ask, is this the right thing to do? Because when he is released, he's about 45 years old. So there's indeed still a risk of committing new offenses. So I think maybe in this case we should consider if civil commitment isn't the more appropriate answer, and also maybe long-term civil commitment or even indefinite civil commitment. And if this person is released, we should actually look at this from the perspective, is he to some extent no longer, or is he cured or healed to some extent? So we don't have adequate treatments, all right, but we can address the symptoms of sexual disorders. So we can do this through chemical castration, what was actually been offered to this individual. And so this brings me to the next two questions. The first is it ethically justified to offer androgen deprivation therapy, chemical castration, to offenders, and from the perspective of the offender first? And secondly, is it ethically justified to offer this from the perspective of society? I think these are very different questions, very important questions, because from the perspective of society, I've just read a very interesting paper by Chris, who actually reviews, it's a draft paper, who actually reviews all the evidence, is this effective? And for CPA and MPA, which is mainly being prescribed in the United States, we don't have any evidence that it's effective in reducing recidivism. But we also don't have any evidence that it's not effective. So what we do know about it is that it's effective in reducing deviant thoughts, in compulsive sexual thoughts. But does it also impact behavior? Does it also prevent recidivism? So we have two different things. Once we know that it helps the offender in, or it can aid the offender in preventing recidivism, but we don't have any hard data on this. And then from the perspective of the offender, of course, this is a very serious treatment, which potentially may have very heavy side effects. And also if you think about long-term treatment. And so, for example, in this particular case, it was suggested that the treatment would be indefinite. The psychiatrist actually suggested that. And of course, there are very serious side effects, such as bone marrow loss, and these may be irreversible. There's bone fracture risk, there's other diseases, metabolism diseases, there's weight gain, there's breast tissue production, there's a various number of potential side effects. So the idea that this can be given indefinite is very worrisome from an ethical perspective, from the perspective of the offender. And then one thing that also struck me is that it's the judge who actually gets to decide how long the treatment is given. Okay, there is a psychiatrist who gives a recommendation, but the judge has to decide this. And this is very different from how it is in Belgium, where actually the psychiatrist decides how long it should be given, and where the offender is actually asked to engage in a contract with a mental health institution to follow a specific treatment plan that is decided by the psychiatrist and negotiated with the offender, which gives you optimal chances that he will actually comply with the treatment plan. So I think this approach actually might work better than to ask of a judge, unless it's a mental health court, of course, because then the judge actually knows what he's talking about. So these are the questions that I want to put for you and that I think are important in this case from an ethical perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for having me here. I'm very excited to hear comments and questions from this group. And of course, it's wonderful to sort of hear everyone's opinions. And I think I've had some of the same thoughts that both Your Honor and you have had with respect to this case. So for me, what was important, or at least sort of what struck me the most at first, was really what we were talking about with this case. The issue was whether this person should have parole for 3 years or 5 years. Now, in the United States, I think this issue would be, I would say, non-significant, right? What we would really be discussing is potentially going for some sort of an SVP, or sexual violent predator commitment, as you mentioned, a civil commitment. And I won't go into sort of the issues that we have with all of those types of commitments, but really just to say how different, I think, culturally, and sort of how distinct these two countries sort of perceive the same offense. So I'll make 3 points. The first one is more related to the law, and I'm looking forward to some feedback from the legal minds here. And again, so I mentioned what struck me was what we were considering here, whether we should be granting parole for 3 or 5 years. So I looked up a little bit of the literature on this, and I was not aware of this, but actually in the United States, as I'm sure some of you would know, there is such a thing as lifetime parole for sex offenders. Now, it's implemented instead of civil commitment, but it is implemented for people who have not gone for civil commitment or where the state has not pursued civil commitment. So there are a few states that do provide this sort of service. I'm not quite sure that the parolees feel the same way, but there's only a couple. And there was a recent ruling just a couple of months ago in Massachusetts in a case that looked specifically at lifetime parole for sex offenders. And the SJC, or our highest court, stated that this was unconstitutional. It was unconstitutional partly because of sort of how the civil the commitment to parole would be triggered. However, sort of to speak to the bigger issue, Massachusetts, in a way, I think through this court is saying that this is something that we would not want to be pursuing with sex offenders. However, we do have SVP programs in the state. And I think the second thing, the point that I want to make is from a clinical stance. As a clinical psychologist, for me, it's always important to sort of get the bigger picture. And I think that here we're focusing very closely on the sexual urges, but what we're missing, I'm afraid, is sort of the bigger picture about this individual. Now, of course, the opinion is limited to what needs to be addressed for this decision. However, I thought what was missing is the number one predictor of reoffense, of sexual violent reoffense, which is psychopathy. And psychopathy is an incredibly strong factor that needs to be evaluated because we want to understand whether this individual is just committing these sexual offenses related to the sexual urges, which could or potentially could not be controlled with some of this medication, or most likely, and what other things are present that are resulting in a greater likelihood of this individual performing these types of acts. And based on some of the information in the case, it seemed like there was a flavor of psychopathic traits for this person that would be very important to think about when we talk about the type of management that we need to have for offenders. The final point that I want to make, and this is also in response to Chris's paper, I think, is sort of the effectiveness of androgen therapy. It is clear that there is ambiguous research to say that this is the number one method and this is sort of how we should go. What I think is not as ambiguous, and I suspect sort of could go along with your point, is that we don't necessarily do just one thing. We don't just provide them with medication, with androgen medication, and then say, okay, everything else is fine. We generally do a number of different things. And again, from a therapeutic stance or from a clinical stance, what we want to be doing is seeing how much does each mode of intervention contribute to relapse or to sort of prevent relapse in these individuals. Now, it is possible that androgen therapy in and of itself is not very effective. What is more likely is that androgen therapy plus 10 other conditions could be fairly effective, though that in itself is sort of a point for consideration. And then sort of along the same lines, that I think applies to this case is generally when individuals do receive androgen therapy or the equivalent of that in the United States, there's usually some sort of a hierarchy. We don't generally start out with administering medication to sex offenders. We usually start out with other things, which was similarly the case here. He went through some, or possibly it was happening at the same time, but it seemed like he was going through groups, and the groups were potentially attending to some of the issues, but maybe were not bringing down the libidinal issues. So again, the idea here is that we want to be looking at multiple treatment approaches at once and seeing how much each can contribute. And that should then, I think, drive some of our discussion about ethics as to whether or not these are effective procedures. Okay.
Thank you. Hello, Brad Cook again, and I actually prepared my remarks, so I'm going to just read them. I have a little difficulty getting my thoughts in order if I have to do this spontaneously. So Nicole asked me to speak today because of my expertise on androgen effects on the brain. My research is focused on how the gonadal hormone testosterone, or T, influences the structure and functioning of a brain region called the medial nucleus of the amygdala, or MEA for short. My dissertation, a long time ago, showed that the medial amygdala is sexually dimorphic. That is, its regional volume, or how big it is greater in adult male rats than in females. The size of the individual nerve cells that constitute the medial amygdala is also sexually dimorphic, being greater in males. More importantly, I found that the sex difference in medial amygdala volume and cell size is controlled by the level of circulating testosterone. That is to say, castration reduces medial amygdala volume of adult males to female-like levels, whereas castration and testosterone replacement prevents that shrinkage. We also found that variation in medial amygdala structure is related to the sexual arousability of male rats. In the presence of an inaccessible female rat, gonadally intact males become very sexually excited. However, within a few days of castration, sensitivity to the opposite sex diminishes until it disappears completely. MEA regional volume and cell size shrink hand in hand with the loss of libido. What does this have to do with sex offenders, you ask? Well, humans also have an amygdala, and it too is sensitive to androgens. In fact, the regional volume of the human amygdala is also greater in men than in women, and the sex difference also emerges during puberty, indicating that rising testosterone levels control neuronal growth and remodeling. The amygdala of men regulates our libido. Erotic images intensely activate men's amygdala, whereas erotic images are far less effective at activating the amygdala of women. And as the resolution of functional MRI has improved, it appears that the medial amygdala is selectively activated in men while viewing or fantasizing about erotic imagery. A central concern of this panel is the efficacy of anti-androgen treatment in the management of sex offenders. Thus, I interrogated the literature to determine whether anti-androgen treatment reduces libido and whether anti-androgen treatment affects the amygdala. And I would like to mention two particularly well-designed studies. First, Studer et al., 2005, looked at 520 unmedicated incarcerated sex offenders. There was a highly significant positive relationship between serum testosterone levels and the degree of sexual violence in the convict's history. There was also a significant positive relationship between serum T levels and sexual recidivism. That is, natural variation in T levels predicts variation in paraphilic behavior. Second, Schober et al., 2005, conducted the only double-blind placebo-controlled study using anti-androgens that I could find. They placed 5 sex offenders on leuprolide acetate, which is also a widely used anti-androgen, and testosterone was reduced to castrate-like levels as expected. More importantly, though, leuprolide significantly reduced the frequency of masturbation and the frequency of intrusive paraphilic thoughts in the convicts. Given what I've said about the amygdala, one might wonder whether the amygdala of sex offenders is different from that of law-abiding people. And indeed, several reports indicate reduced gray matter volumes in the amygdala of incarcerated sex offenders. Additionally, the amygdala of sex offenders is activated by images consistent with their paraphilic preference, not by images that we would consider erotic. I found one study in which a relationship between circulating testosterone and medial amygdala function was observed in sex offenders. Here, subjects' response to paraphilic erotic images, such as naked children, was measured before and after leuprolide treatment. Before leuprolide, convicts' medial amygdala was very sensitive to images consistent with their paraphilia. However, after chemical castration with leuprolide, medial amygdala activation in response to such images was drastically reduced. So thus, in this very brief overview, I've pointed to human and animal research indicating a key role for the medial amygdala in the hormone-dependent control of male libido. It seems well established that circulating testosterone controls paraphilic urges in participants whose T levels freely vary and in participants whose T levels were manipulated in a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, which is considered the gold standard of scientific design. Finally, functional imaging studies suggest that paraphilic sensitivity to erotic images is controlled by the medial amygdala, and that androgen depletion reduces their sensitivity by remodeling this brain structure. In conclusion, in my opinion, there is considerable behavioral, neuroanatomic, and neurophysiological evidence that testosterone regulates libido in men and animals, and that it does so in part through its effects on the medial amygdala. Thus, I believe that chemical castration should remain a first-line therapy to reduce the criminal motivations of paraphilic men. Thanks.
An observation, I think, and a question, perhaps useless, but maybe provocative. So I read the case of Williamson and was exasperated by what's missing from it. That's just autobiographical. One thing that is in it, though, is this, that the justification for requiring that he take these drugs was twofold. One, a concern for public safety, and secondly, to encourage him to continue in rehabilitation. Now, here's the observation. I found it a bit puzzling that there wasn't a third justification, namely, at least an attempt to render him criminally responsible or to make him criminally responsible for his behavior, given that he was out of prison. And here's what's behind the observation. In the 2014 hearing, it's assumed that Williamson, without the drugs, lacks self-control, and that's why he's a risk. But if we believe him to be a threat without the chemical intervention, then doesn't that mean that we also believe that without the drugs, he is more or less immune to the normal deterrent effects of the law? And if he's immune to the law's deterring effects, then that seems to be grounds for saying that he can't be held legally responsible. Now, maybe that's a mistake, but if you're immune to the deterring effects of the law, yeah, maybe it's a mistake, but it seems to me plausible that if you're immune to those effects, then that would be grounds for at least saying that your responsibility is attenuated. So I was just puzzled. I thought, well, maybe there should be a third justification. Okay, so that's the comment. Now here's my question. I am a philosopher after all, so I get to do a bit of science fiction. So suppose that things have changed in such a way so that we can actually produce reliable psychological profiles of you and me based on whatever. You can fill in the science fiction as you see fit. Brain scans, chemical assays, behavioral observations, and so on, to the point where we can reliably predict, based on these profiles, which individuals are likely to commit certain crimes, say violent sexual crimes. Well then, on this science fiction scenario, if we think that we're justified in requiring Williamson to take the drugs as a matter of public safety, then shouldn't we also say that we are thereby justified, I mean, to be consistent, that we are thereby justified in requiring that these other persons whose profiles fit the violent sexual profile, but who haven't done anything yet, that they too have to take these drugs? And if you say, no, we ought not to require people before they've committed the crime, even though we have a highly reliable profile that predicts that they are likely to commit such crimes, then I'm puzzled as to why we would insist that we're justified in requiring Williamson, even though we've released him into the public.
All right, so we're going to open the floor up to questions. Do we have a microphone that we want the floor to use?
You want to use one of these? You can use one of these.
Does someone who has a booming voice want to ask the first question before we have a mic? The gentleman here in tan shirt?
So one idea that a lot of y'all reference is sort of this notion that there's an overwhelming sexual urge, and then there's something like self-control, and the overwhelming sexual urge overwhelms the thing called self-control, and that's why you have child molestation or violent sexual assault or whatever. And I was wondering if there's any evidence, or if y'all have, a particular justification as to why this is sort of the model, especially given that when we talk about rape in normal circumstances, this is, I think, would be considered sort of obscene in a lot of cases, to say that what's happening in sort of an adult raping another adult is that there's an overwhelming urge that cannot be stopped, because to say that would be to say that, for instance, men have no responsibility, that men cannot control their sexual urges. So I guess I wonder, is there justification for this sort of assumption?
I can briefly remark on that. Over the last several days, I've been reading about these issues very much for the first time, and I was just struck by how frequently it's mentioned that sex offenders have low IQ. And so it's a very common attribute as far as I understand it. And thus, I think there's grounds for believing that, yes, indeed, there is a neurobiological substrate for less self-control.
Why don't you go ahead and...
Well, I think, yeah. One important thing is that there's a huge difference between a sex offender full stop and a sex offender with a sexual disorder. And so what we're talking about here is a sex offender with a sexual disorder, and then you'll be thinking about maybe administering ADT. Of course, if you have a sexual offender that offends from aggressive motives, ADT wouldn't do a thing. It's completely different. So I think that's a very big difference that we need to make. And I think in case of sexual disorders, we can indeed talk about loss of control, but not in every case of rape, of course. It's not the same thing.
If I can follow up, is it then established that sex offenders against children are not acting out of aggressive motives and are acting purely out of sexual motives?
Of course not, yeah.
No. That has not been established. I mean, there's a lot of heterogeneity within each group. So whether it be an offender that offends against children or who offends against adult males or females, there's heterogeneity. Now, I think what we're suggesting, or at least it sounds like, and I agree with, is that there is a group of individuals who have specific, we call them disorders, but a specific set of symptoms that make it more difficult for them to control themselves around these particular urges. Now, it is not impossible for them to do it. In fact, they do it most of the time, right? They're not walking around the street and raping everyone. What we see in sort of the reason that we would administer this type of treatment would be to say, we know that you have this particular issue and we're very concerned about it. Because we're very concerned, for public safety reasons and also for your own benefit, to protect you, and there's sort of parents' patriot component of it, we are going to make you do this, and this being the androgen therapy plus a select number. And again, androgen therapy is very rarely administered independently of other treatment.
I think the short answer to your question is no, we don't.
Yes, well done.
We don't know about that. I mean, we've got theories, with the mice and everything. But
I thought the question was, how do psychiatrists do the diagnosis, and is there evidence to justify the diagnosis? And I take it that's the answer.
Well, I
Or
wouldn't
an
say
answer.
the answer is no.
Yeah, not to that
To
question.
I think the answer to that question is, so if we reframe the question to say, can we effectively diagnose an individual who has a particular sexual disorder from an individual who does not, I would say that we have some reliability in doing this, so basically we can do it somewhat consistently. We're not very good at it. In fact, we're probably worse at doing this with sex offenders than we are with any other disorder. But it is also not to say that we're sort of randomly saying this individual has it and this person. There is sort of criteria that are empirically based. Now, again, this is one subset of disorders that is incredibly problematic in the literature, and there is not reliability or validity, but it's not completely random. It's slightly less random.
Almost done.
I was a little surprised that noting that Paul seemed to raise the issue of the defendant's rights in all of this. I'm not familiar with the case, and I don't know very much about the law outside of the United States. But I have had, when we're talking about what I think would be the equivalent in the United States with preventative detention hearings, preventative detention custody, I have this worry that we are, in effect, sentencing someone twice for the same crime. And I completely understand the impulse to wanting to protect people from the really, really bad folk. But at the same time, I think our theories of punishment in this country are really about going after someone who's actually committed an act as opposed to locking people up prior to doing an act. And I get increasingly disturbed by this notion that somehow it's okay if the person has done something really bad that we can trample on their rights.
Comment on that a couple ways. One thing, my reaction when I read this is I think under United States standards, you could not impose an extension of his parole period that wasn't part of the original sentence. Now, the workaround for that is rather than imposing it as parole, it's done through civil measures, whether that's tied to, well, sexually dangerous person or just sexual offender registration requirements. But this kind of treatment is typically, I think, only done, and it sounds like done under Australian law, as a matter of consent. And almost all of the interventions I was talking about, mental illness courts, which involve some pretty significant commitments to take medication or not to, they're all consensual. You can argue about how consensual, but generally they're done with a fair amount of due process, including the right to counsel, the right to hearings, an adversary system. The other point I'd just make quickly about Paul's question is, and also the issue you raised, there is a very long tradition of constraining people who are deemed to be a danger to themselves and the community. Now, traditionally, that is a small subset because it's a larger subset. It's been shrunk over the last probably 50 years. It's maybe growing again. But that was where we had a high confidence level that if allowed to just go out into society, they would hurt maybe themselves, but more significantly hurt other people. The fact that we may be better at predicting that with technology may change, but the underlying rationale has been around, I think, for hundreds of years in the common law systems. And so that's not, it's not a new phenomenon, it's just a new experience of that phenomenon.
Well, if I could, I don't know what they have in Georgia, but certainly in California they've got preventative detention, where you are physically, it doesn't have anything to do with drug therapy.
Right.
And then you may or may not get therapy while you're in preventative detention, but you're not allowed to leave the prison grounds, for example, even though you served your sentence, which is what I would take to be kind of the equivalent of what's going on there.
I don't think you can be constrained at the prison, but at the mental institution or other.
No, on the prison grounds, you're just not allowed to leave. But the other issue is, at least in Ohio and Kentucky, where I'm familiar, if you're deemed a danger to yourself or others, it's an imminent threat. It's not the idea that at some point you might crack and do something, we don't have any idea when. It's that it's going to be happening now within the next few minutes.
So that's the grounds for civil commitment.
Right.
Right, and that's sort of the issue is that
Imminence issue is big.
Right, yeah, imminence is big, but yeah, the issue, that becomes a civil commitment issue, whereas I wasn't clear, I agree with you, I wasn't quite clear sort of exactly how this would translate into the American system, because the issue in this case in particular was not sort of a civil commitment per se, it was some sort of additional punishment.
Right. I will say what's interesting, and Chris and I have talked about this, Georgia had a chemical castration provision in our sexual offender laws, and it wasn't used much, it appeared, and then it was eliminated, and trying to figure out why. There's no real history of why it was eliminated, but when Katerina mentioned lifetime parole. In looking at it, when it was eliminated, one thing they did is they made sexual offenses have lifetime probation if you were to get any probation or parole at all. Under federal law, for most sexual offenses, judges can and usually do impose lifetime supervised release, which is essentially the same as parole or probation. And what that does, even if it's not implemented in any serious way, it gives you that hook legally that you're not increasing their sentence. Their sentence is a lifetime sentence, and then you just regulate the sentence as you go along. But I think that's the way we've already set up for most of these sexual offenders in most states.
Okay, our next question?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for magnificent talks that pull in different directions. That's what I love in neuroethics. So I'm going to pose 3 questions that pull into very different directions. First, the question of whether we're intervening, creating a new intervention. We could pose an alternative question. Should we perhaps intervene in the public to protect the public? So the first short question is there any data on the efficacy of publicly available information on sex offenders versus chemical castration and so on and so forth? Second question that pulls in totally different direction is that if medial amygdala is implicated, is there any evidence on medial amygdala lesions being effective in reducing such behavior? And is there any data on virtual lesions using deep TMS or other more specific neuroscientific techniques? Third and last questions regarding culpability or reduced culpability of the offender, with which we started this discussion with. Was this person abused as a child?
All right, so we have 3 questions there. The first one has to do with public, intervening in the public, correct? Does anyone want to address that first question? Or should we skip to lesioning the amygdala? Morse would like to have that.
Obviously, most sexual offender registration requirements have a very strong public availability, and if you know a lot of people who have kids, they generally will run it and check, see who lives in their neighborhood. So I think there is some public intervention, and the sexual offender laws, whether it's a regulation of the offender or not, regulate where you live, where you who you can have contact with. So that's certainly another way to come at it. It may tie into the point that you come at this actually through a whole bunch of different ways, hoping that one of them will work.
But is it ethical to do that through a registry? Because thinking about rights of perpetrators, actually, I think in Belgium we don't really have that, or they're starting to think about that. But from my perspective, I think it's horrific that something like that is done, because if you give a person a sentence, then they're getting like a lifelong additional sentence of stigma and things like that that will prevent them from getting better at any point in time. So from my perspective, European perspective, I think that United States, I don't know what they are thinking.
I'd say the general rationale is the alternative is the only safe way to do it is to keep you in custody. So if we're not going to keep...
Which is worse.
Which are not going to keep you in custody, these are things we'll do to give you an opportunity to not be in custody.
Well, other things can give you an opportunity, like treatment. You don't necessarily need the registry.
I mean, it's a very good question, and it's the sort of question that there should be an answer for. It's not going to be easy to design that sort of trial, but you can compare. I mean, the US is great for this because there's 50 states and they all do weird things. And some of them are like other ones, more or less. So it would be interesting to know whether states that have offender registries have lower incidence of recidivism or not. It theoretically should be possible to find out.
Is there any data on that?
I'm not aware of it if there is.
Because then we would have a reason. Then it would be partially justifiable to implement it.
This area is not greatly data-driven, it must be said.
That is very true.
So quickly about the lesioning of the amygdala. There's very sparse evidence that lesions to the amygdala reduce sexual offenders. In fact, there's not very much data at all. The most salient example or point would be the famous Kluver-Bucy syndrome, wherein lesions to the amygdala lead to a loss of sexual selectivity in which the patient or experimental animal no longer has any particular preference but becomes sexually aroused by almost everything. I should also mention, though, that surgical interventions have been tried for aggression, and quite often the amygdala has been a target there. But my understanding is that those interventions are not very successful either. So in terms of reducing aggression, anti-androgen treatment is also very effective as far as I understand it. So rather than permanently lesion the brain, you can simply reduce androgen levels and reduce aggression.
All right, and there was a third question that I have now forgotten. Do you want to remind us?
Yeah, was the perpetrator abused as a child?
I mean, I've read the case, and my memory is that that's not mentioned in the case.
All right. So we had two persons with questions.
One of the things that's been talked about is how this is a new and a growing area. How do we deal with all this scientific information in the legal context? But I wonder to what extent that the law is going to have limited resources as we increasingly have medicalization of what were previously legal categories. So, for example, when we are concerned about preventive detention and things like that, when we think about it from a public health perspective or an epidemiological perspective, we know sometimes that someone, let's say, who has tuberculosis might be detained, and no one says they're guilty of anything. It's simply a necessary and statistical function of, our predictive math that we decide we have to detain you. And there's no question of their, we do it minimally as we can, but there's no question of their guilt or innocence or anything like that. I wonder what you think that with the increased medicalization or pathologization of things that have been previously legal categories, will we be moving to a more epidemiological way of looking at this as opposed to the criminological?
I guess sort of the first thing that came to mind as you were talking about it, it sounded like part of that your point was a cost analysis, cost-benefit analysis. In an abstract sense, if we were talking about either detaining sex offenders or, providing extreme interventions that we might not necessarily consider ethical, the benefit from a purely monetary stance, I suspect, would be much higher than not doing so, partly because of the damage that they cause to the victims, which then go on to cost thousands and much more money. So from a monetary stance, I think that even if this is to happen, that there would be sort of in the bigger scheme of things. But that's, of course, looking at a very, very large picture, and obviously all of these institutions work independently and don't necessarily work. So, there's obviously major financial deficits in the criminal justice system, which is causing a lot of problems in itself, so I'm not sure.
You laid out a system of saying it's sexual urges versus sexual control. So we've got this fight going on in the brain of the amygdala fighting something else, I guess, or our sexual urges. And this is a question sort of for the defense bar as well as neuroscientists. We now believe we can control sexual urges through sort of chemical castration or whatever. Is there a possible way to increase self-control rather than to decrease someone's sexual urges so you're not bothering what they are as a person as much? And would that satiate the defense bar?
So first, at least from my stance, I want to clarify, it is not one versus the other at all. So it is that some individuals with particular disorders may have, so obviously everything is qualified from a psychology stance, and I know that is difficult for the law, but so these are, or at least I do not view them at all as two opposing ideas. I think your second point about improving ability to, or increasing self-control, there is some very interesting neurointerventions out there. I'm going to be talking about one of them later today, which is sort of potentially using TDCS to decrease impulsivity. And if that's something that you're thinking about, I think, yeah, absolutely, going in that direction might be very interesting. Now, being able to apply that to forensic settings and really doing so ethically is very far off, and we want to be incredibly cautious before we translate any of the research that is being done in healthy populations to individuals who are in correctional settings, because really there's just lots of very significant demographic differences that could account for unknown consequences.
Can I say, this is an area, we're all thinking chemical intervention, but non-chemical intervention, anger management class for violence. You know, that's a regular thing that gets required for people who are engaged in low-level domestic and other violent attacks. I mean, I don't know how well it's studied. I don't know how well the neurology of it is understood, but you know, as a practical matter, that is a neurointervention of some sort that is going on every day all over the place.
Well, there's a lot of experimental work also in that, well, not a lot, but there is experimental work in that area. For example, for addiction, they're looking at neurofeedback, which is completely non-invasive, which will not take away all your sexual desire, for example, but could help you gain more control over your behavior. So in addiction, this is working, and some people say that sexual disorders have something in common with addiction in general. So they are looking at this, and I think this is way more defensible with the view to the future. Also, relating to the previous question, I think the idea of looking at violence and criminal behavior as a public health issue is an extremely important question that we need to ask. And there are some defenders of it, like Dirk Peterboom, the famous philosopher, who actually suggests that we should be looking at that in this way. I'm not sure if we should, but I think we need to ask the question and we need to think about it. Yeah.
Can I just add that I think it's a great question. In reading the case, I thought when you chemically castrate Williamson, you're not increasing his self-control at all. You're sucking some of the vitality out of him. Now, granted, it's vitality that is awful, but you haven't done anything to enhance his self-control. You've just made it less likely that he is going to behave really badly. So I take your question to be a question for the psychiatrists or the neuroscientists, and that is there any reason to think that there are neural mechanisms that implement some more or less maybe modular capacity for controlling ourselves, even if it's a suite of different neural mechanisms? I love the question. I have no idea what the answer is.
So my question is actually very similar to that one. I was thinking about how mental illness is handled. I can only speak for Washington, D.C., but if someone is judged to be an imminent threat to themselves or to somebody else, then generally they are put in a hospital until they're deemed fit to return to just their everyday lives. And I guess I want to speak to Paul Davies' thought experiment, where if we could determine well in advance that this person would at some point become a threat to somebody else, or potentially even to themselves, if we should lock them up. And it seems like what's happening there is we're deciding whether freedom or safety is more important. We're making a value judgment. It seems like in America, traditionally, freedom has been the choice over safety, which is why we generally wait until someone commits a crime to put them into jail. But speaking to the last question, I think what I wonder, after thinking about all of this, is whether or not putting someone in a situation where they have to get treated as opposed to choosing to get treated, or at the very least, when they can choose, it seems like it's almost not a real choice because there are such severe consequences for not choosing to be treated. If taking away that person's agency in that way, rather than making them recover, might actually hinder their recovery, hinder the ability of them to continue to improve and make progress in their treatment, because it's not treatment they're choosing, it's treatment that's being forced onto them.
So I can speak to just the last part. I think, again, I just want to emphasize that most of these treatments are not done on their own. So usually it is accompanied by some sort of psychotherapy. Now, it's not to say that any of that psychotherapy is effective. We have lots of issues with those. But theoretically, at least, the goal would be to sort of reduce these sort of fairly severe libidinal urges that they're not able to, or at least it is very difficult for them to contain, and at the same time to be able to provide them with the appropriate skills, such as being able to manage stress better, or being able to distract themselves when they have too many urges. So those two things are generally happening simultaneously. The problem, I think, and this has to do with the efficacy or the effectiveness of these treatments, is that they're quite low. So although that's the idea, it's not really an effective way to go scientifically, but that's sort of what's going on. And I think that's only addressing the last piece of your question.
And when she says quite low, she means there's no actual evidence that they're effective in terms of reducing recidivism, which isn't to say that they're not effective in reducing recidivism. They may, it's just that there's no actual evidence of that. I just wanted to just briefly pick up on the civil commitment thing, which has come up a few times, just to comment really, because it's an area of interest of mine, that the United States is likely to find itself increasingly out on a limb on this as well. It's the whole execution thing, the whole locking up mentally ill thing, because the dangerousness standard, and the United States has a lot of states have this imminent danger thing, which is quite unusual anywhere else in the world, but the whole dangerousness standard is beginning to ebb away in the rest of the world, and there's much more a move towards basing civil detention of mentally ill people on their lack of decision-making capacity around receiving treatment. Now that's only just starting. In fact, Australia's the world leader in that at the moment, but well, probably Scotland was, and then Australia. But the US, not so much. There's really very little scholarship coming out about that, partly because the US hasn't signed on to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
I'd say it may also be an issue that judicial opinions have made the ability to get away from imminent danger difficult, and so the workaround in many ways are things like these mental illness courts, where, because most people who have significant mental illness will do something at a low level that could be prosecuted, and then using that as the hook to require them to get treatment. But, I think we may be locked in to, I guess it's the opposite end. The executions are allowed because the Supreme Court here says they're allowed, from kind of a conservative standpoint, but the mental illness limitations are limited because the Supreme Court, from a liberal perspective, has limited how much you can do.
Yes, I had a question because both in the panel's reactions to the case and also in the following discussion, this issue of the efficacy of chemical castration keeps coming up, and you pointed out that you came across one placebo-controlled trial. You said there is no evidence, but I've looked a lot at the ethical controversies surrounding placebo-controlled trials, but always in a different context, because generally it is thought that there can be lots of unethical aspects of placebo-controlled trials for the trial subjects. But this is a completely different context. Here you would be thinking about, is it even ethical to do a placebo-controlled trial from the perspective of society? So the efficacy issue is very important, I think, and it's like, if it is efficacious, then our ethical evaluation of the questions would change. But does anyone from the panel want to comment on whether they actually think it would be a good idea to conduct placebo-controlled trials to determine or to attempt to determine the efficacy of chemical castration?
Well, I think I can take that up because I may have inadvertently misconstrued the study. It was a within-subject study in which the participants received placebo or leuprolide in a randomized order, so that there wasn't a group of individuals that received only the placebo. Everyone received leuprolide. It was done, and the process took place over many, many months, such that I think the leuprolide treatment may have been 8 or 9 months long, and so too was the placebo. So in that respect, they could, I think, identify efficacy quite effectively, because all the measures that they looked at in terms of the intrusiveness of thoughts, the frequency of masturbation, and so forth, all were reduced during the leuprolide treatment and were unaffected during the placebo treatment.
Look, yeah, I think there is, basically there's no evidence about recidivism, so, which is the thing we're interested in, right? It is certainly the case, I'm not going to give too much away here because there's a talk on it in the parallel session, an excellent talk. This is not that good. There is evidence for exactly this sort of thing with individuals and what they report and even what sex offenders report. Mind you, there's also evidence that sex offenders may not be completely honest when they're reporting this stuff. But what we haven't got is a trial, and it doesn't have to be a placebo trial either. We just haven't got a good trial comparing anti-androgens with something else. And do I think we should have? Yes, I think we are duty-bound to do that. And because we don't know whether it stops recidivism or not, there's not really a particularly large ethical problem about the possibility of putting the community at risk, because at the moment we don't know that we are putting the community at risk. In fact, it could be the other way around. We're telling the community we're stopping to put them at risk, but in fact we're not.
I don't agree. I'm sorry.
That's good. Because it would be terribly boring.
I think you're saying we don't have the data that they're effective in reducing recidivism, so there's no ethical worry. But we do have data that they're effective in lowering testosterone and in lowering intrusive thoughts. So I think there is an added risk to society. It's potentially hypothetical, or it's likely maybe, but there is an added risk. So we have to think about it, and I think it's actually, I wouldn't say that there's no problem at all. I think we have to think about it very carefully, but from my perspective, especially if we think of offenders like Terry, I think it would not be defensible to actually put offenders in that kind of trial without the chemical castration.
But since we don't know whether it actually makes it less likely that he will reoffend, and since it was 20 years ago.
I understand, but he was checked in 2011 as to having a moderate to high risk of reoffending.
Yes.
So if you would release him in 2012 with this moderate to high risk without the chemical castration, of which we know that it helps reduce his deviant thoughts, I think there is an added risk to society that we have to take seriously. I mean, a sexual offense, an individual that experiences that is for the rest of their life. That they're having you're a psychiatrist, you know this.
I'm not for sexual offence, just I'm against that.
I mean, I understand that we need the data, but saying that there's really no ethical worry in doing these trials, I think is a step too far.
Can I throw in something here? Which is, one of the things that struck me was how often sex offenders actually request the therapy because they don't like the state that they're in. They realize the jeopardy that they put the community in with these intrusive thoughts. They realize the intrusive thoughts are causally related to their criminal behavior. And I think it's quite interesting and telling that these offenders actually request anti-androgen therapy because they believe there's a causal relationship between the use of these drugs and the likelihood of offending.
I think there's a big question of motivation as to why they're requesting this. And I think a lot of times they can pick up on sort of, and in fact they should pick up on sort of what the right way of getting through your time in prison is and how to get a parole hearing and all those things. So I think just because they're asking for it, I think we should not necessarily assume that they in fact recognize that causal relationship. In fact, most of the time we know that they have very significant cognitive distortions and lack the ability to sort of see the connections between the urges and behaviors and sort of all the things that are happening. But
you can educate individuals on that, though. I mean, that's what's happening in Belgium. I mean,
The one effect that I understand we do know about is the bone density loss.
Oh yeah, that's clear.
And that, of course, has led these drugs to not be used for, for other purposes. and has led to significant problems for women at much, much, much lower doses than are being used. And there's no studies that I've ever seen, correct me if I'm wrong, but showing that it's safe in males because it was used for other purposes. So what do we know about the bone density losses and other potential problems to these individuals? Because that raises other ethical issues. If we don't know it works to stop the behavior, we do know it causes these health problems, then we've got another problem on our hands.
If only one of the speakers in the parallel session had reviewed. Oh, I did. But in short, because I want someone to come, actually, I don't really mind if no one comes. Yes, we do. We know a lot about this because a lot of this can be taken from studies on people with prostate cancer. So you can use big numbers, thousands and thousands, not 5, thousands of people. They do tend to be older, the prostate cancer victims, but not all of them. And yes, you lose bone at a tremendous rate, so that the figure that sticks in my mind is that a year after you started the anti-androgen therapy, you're 5 times more likely to have a fracture that will put you into hospital. Now again, that's older people, so that won't necessarily directly translate to younger people, and there are therapies that you can use to counteract that to a certain extent.
But these individuals are not given those therapies, and they're often started on these drugs, at very young ages and have to take them year after year after year.
Well, certainly in Australia, they are.
Yeah, in Belgium as well, they get monitored and they get additional medications to counteract the bone marrow loss. Also, I think the general recommendation is no longer than 4 to 5 years because then you get irreversible effects that even if you stop treatment, you can't give any treatment to. Yeah. So then, I mean, long-term use is definitely ethically worrisome. Longer than 4 to 5 years is definitely ethically problematic, or you could even say unethical. Yeah.
All right, I think
there's a range of other side effects as well, which you'll have to come.
There's also some authors, though, that do suggest that after 4 to 5 years and adequate psychological therapy, it can be sufficient in some individuals, but yeah, depending on the individual, of course.
All right, we have 2 questions from our hosts, one from Nicole and one from Eddie.
Oh, no, I can't. You're a philosopher, we can't do that. Okay, so my question is, it harks back to some of the earlier comments that a couple of you made. One was, think of violence and criminal behavior as a public health issue, which was, I think, you, Farah. And I actually think, no, I have huge problems with that. Why? Well, if only because I would like to retain scope for the possibility that some people deserve the judgment of, no, you are actually bad. You did something that you knew you oughtn't to do. And I would hate to think that what we're going to do is to pathologize all bad behavior such that there will be 2 species of behavior, largely good behavior or simply not morally relevant behavior, and then sick behavior. So everybody who does something wrong, they're just sick, right? Now, of course, it's not that I want to see people suffer at the hand of the criminal justice system that I want to make sure that we retain... Look, I've got very strong retributive intuitions. But rather that I think that we would be, if we went down this line, what we would be doing is we would be closing our eyes to one part of the moral landscape, which, at least intuitively, we do have. And certainly the criminal justice system does embody the fact that we have got this part of the landscape. And this also ties in with a comment that Paul made about making people responsible, because without the drugs, after all, he's dangerous. And again, there might be lots of people who might be dangerous without certain kinds of interventions, but I would hate to think that therefore means that they're not fully responsible moral agents. They might be irresponsible moral agents, just to use to hark back to my taxonomy of responsibility concepts, but the mere fact that somebody is irresponsible, bad, doesn't yet mean that therefore they're not responsible in the fully responsible sense, if you know what I mean, the capacity sense. So, could you comment on that? Anybody? Could someone comment on this, please?
I I think actually you're completely right. And if we do say, yes, we should look at it as a public health issue, then we're completely ignoring the victim's side and the right of the victims. So that's why I didn't want to give any specific, I'm actually thinking about this question a lot, but I don't have an answer yet. Because the main reason for not seeing it as a public health issue is indeed society and the victims. But then on the other hand, if we think of sexual disorders, for example, or other mental illnesses as brain diseases, and if we compare it to heart disease, for example, what we do with a heart disease is treatment. So why do we think differently about brain diseases? But that's just one view on things. And then the other view is the implications of that kind of way of thinking and the implications of that kind of way of thinking for society. And I think we have very strong reasons to actually be compatibilists in the way we approach criminal justice. I don't think we have scientific reasons for it, but I think we do have various other reasons for it. Yeah. So I'm not saying yes to the question. I just think it's an important question from a scientific point of view. Yeah.
My thought when you asked the question before was it's more the public health techniques, the epidemiological ideas that really are coming into the criminal justice system. When you look at the rationale for criminal justice reform, if you hear politicians talk about it, is we have been doing things this way and it doesn't work. And when you study it, we can do it cheaper and we can do things effectively that work. By work means less recidivism. There is a danger, I think, of putting it in terms of public health, unless the public health you're talking about is protecting the public and not so much the people on the other end. But the techniques are overlapping more and more substantially, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, frankly, that's a good thing for government in general to think about what things they do actually produce positive results as opposed to relying on anecdotes or things that have been done for a long time.
Let's see. This may fail. Two responses to the question, the last part of Nicole's question. First, for what this is worth, this is just sort of a gunshot response, or no, not gunshot. What is it? Shotgun. Thank you. The caffeine has left my system. I've already checked out. I'm sorry. Neuroethics. So, I mean, I think we should be skeptical about most of our moral intuitions. So, there. She missed it, so I won't repeat it. But the second thing is, it was really a conditional. So if we think that we're justified in requiring Williamson to take these drugs, on the assumption that if he doesn't, he is a threat to the community, then doesn't that mean that we're also assuming that without the drugs, he is insufficiently sensitive to the deterrent effect of the law? Now, I see Professor Morse shaking his head, so obviously I'm wrong. But that was my assumption, that if we think that without the drugs he's a threat, and so our justification is give him the drugs, require the drugs, because otherwise he's a danger, then it sounds to me like what we're saying is, oh, well then without the drugs, his lack of self-control or his intrusive thoughts make him such that he is no longer sensitive to the deterrent effects. I mean, when he was committing all those rapes in 89 and 90, he surely knew that he could spend a lot of time in prison for that, and it didn't seem to make any difference. So it was a conditional like that. It wasn't to say, well, I'll just leave it there.
So I'm going to release you all very shortly. Nicole has agreed to give you until 3:10, so we'll still have close to a 20-minute break, and then the breakout rooms are upstairs, so you should be able to find them. There's lots of signs. Also, because the conference did not charge you registration, we do have enough to give you a nice reception tonight, but if you want coffee or snacks now, you'll have to get them yourselves, and there's some places right here, Einstein's. If it seems crowded, there's some other places you might find around, like a coffee shop in the library, but For non-locals, you might have a harder time. Actually, why don't the locals leave the people who aren't local to go to Einstein's and you go find your coffee elsewhere. I also wanted to remind everybody that the conference dinner still has a few spaces left. It will be a wonderful place with lots of wonderful people. Alma Cucina, if that's how you pronounce it, and it's at 6:30 or something tomorrow. And if you want to get in on that, you need to let somebody at the registration desk know and go ahead and pay for it. It's $45, which includes tax and tips, not drinks. Anything else about logistics? Okay. I was almost on this panel, but as you can see, it's too full, and so I kind of got booted off, but that's okay. And so I'm not going to ask a question. I'm just going to rehearse a point that's come up a lot, and as someone interested in free will, I think it's something we should keep in mind for the whole conference, including this issue that's come up here, which is this distinction between a person or a criminal, in the cases here, their desires, their urges, what they want. And within that, a distinction that Harry Frankfurt gave us between sort of urges or bare first-order desires and second-order desires or reflective desires on which urges you want to have. And in these cases, we're not clear about what Williamson's case was or other offenders, but it's an interesting question to know if we're trying to intervene on them. Do we want to intervene on their first-order urges? Do we want to somehow shape their second-order reflective desires so that they have better first-order desires? Or, on the other side, do we want to control their self-control abilities or enhance their self-control abilities such that even if they have bad urges, if they know they're going to do something bad, we can give them the self-control to deter themselves because they'd rather not spend the rest of their lives in jail. So with that, I think we should really thank this wonderful panel.
I was going to come to you, thank you, because I've heard it all. I would have.